Well, if I have a little bit of a cold, and if I start to sneeze, and I do this number here, I'll have to remember the microphone's actually here tonight. So anyway, why isn't it up here, you're wondering? Well, the plug back here, when Dink turned off the thing, it sort of just crumbled, which was kind of weird. But anyway, it's okay because, see, in theory, the FCC actually sold the frequency that the wireless that I used this morning and have been using. They sold the frequency to cell phone carriers. So by the middle of next year, if I use that one, we'd be hearing cell phone conversations up and down 412 here. That'd be kind of interesting. But anyway, it was sort of a shock to me earlier this week. I was like, there's something else I need to be doing. Like, oh yeah, you have to preach on Sunday night. Because it's been almost a month since I've preached on Sunday night. We had a singing service, we had an Agape Sunday, then last week was the area-wide. So that's the three Sunday nights in a row there. So anyway, if you would open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. Once again, Jesus is using parables to teach people. And once again, he is using a real-life example of basing his parable on real life rather than just on a hypothetical situation. See, under the Jewish law, there were 3 or 4 specific times of prayer throughout the course of the day. 9 a.m., noon, which was actually removed in later Judaism, 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. And at each of those times, you were supposed to spend in prayer. The strict Jew, or the Orthodox Jew, was very careful to observe each of these times very, very meticulously. Pharisees were especially strict about observing these times of prayer. Well, Jesus had been talking about prayer to those who were following him. He had told them a parable about a very persistent widow in order to teach his disciples that they should always pray and not give up, and never give up praying. He then sees an entirely different group of people. People who methodically observed each time of prayer. And people who thought that they were okay, well, because they were okay. They thought God would bless them because they were so meticulous about observing the times of prayer, so exact and so intent on observing those times of prayer, not letting anything interfere. So in Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, Jesus tells another parable. And this time he aims directly at those people. He says, or we read, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. There are 2 characters in the story, a Pharisee and a tax collector. In order to appreciate the parable, we need to look at these 2 characters and 3 things about each of these characters. First, who they were. Second, what they prayed. And third, how they acted. So let's begin, as Jesus did, with the Pharisee. When we talk about Pharisees, the first thing we want to know is, well, who were they? Well, who he was, the name means the separated one. And that's what the word Pharisee means. He had separated himself from ordinary activities of life He had separated himself from his fellow man. In fact, they considered it defilement to have anything at all to do with anyone who didn't meticulously observe the law like they themselves did. So if you were not another Pharisee, they didn't want to have anything to do with you. That's how separated they were from you. In fact, a certain Rabbi Simeon once said, "If there are only two righteous men in the world, I and my son are those two. If there is only one, I am he." So, they didn't lack confidence, okay? That was just the way the Pharisees were. Their job was obeying the law of Moses. Now, in the law of Moses, there were 613 specific commands that Moses received from God. 613, that's a full-time job if there ever was one, if that's what you're going to do. If all you're going to do is obey the law of Moses, then those 613, that would keep you busy. But the Pharisees had amplified those 613 laws into tens of thousands of petty regulations covering every aspect of life and every action of life, every moment of life. Let me give you an example. The washing of hands. Okay, that seems to be a fairly simple process, right? To us, it does. However, to eat food with unwashed hands was a grave sin leading to poverty and disaster. Now again, in general, this would be a pretty good practice, a good, healthy rule to keep in mind. But to the Pharisees, the hands had to be washed a certain way. First of all, water had to be kept specifically for that purpose. So you had special water for hand washing. Then, at least a quarter of a log had to be used. Now, what is a quarter of a log? Well, about 1.5 eggshells is the minimum amount required to properly wash your hands. And what would happen was the water would be poured over both hands, and then the palms of each hand would be cleansed by rubbing the fist of the other hand in the palm. And then you would do the other one. Once you had done that for a sufficient amount of time, then you had to hold your hands up like so that the water dripped off the wrists. But that's not all. Then you had to repeat the whole process with the rubbing of the fist and the palm and everything. But this time you had to let the water drip off the tips of the finger. Only then were your hands clean enough to eat. And to omit or alter any of this was considered a deadly sin. So that tells us a little bit, about the Pharisee, who he was. Now let's look for a moment at what he prayed. Notice he stood and prayed. Now some people find that to be a problem. They say, well, why would he stand and pray, and everything? Well, standing was a normal Jewish posture for prayer. It was just how Jews would pray. Showed respect for God, standing in his presence and so forth. I remember a place one time where we worshiped that had a guy who, anytime he led a prayer publicly, he said, "Would you please stand out of respect for God?" And he wouldn't pray unless people were standing out of respect for God. And I talked to him one time about that, and I said, well, what if somebody doesn't want to stand, but they want to kneel? He said, well, but that's not, I said, but that's a perfectly acceptable posture for prayer in the Bible. And we looked at some scriptures. I said, what if they wanted to lay on the floor prostrate on the ground? That's a perfectly acceptable posture for prayer. It's a perfectly acceptable posture for prayer if they want to just sit in the pew as well. God's not so interested in the external posture as he is the internal posture. That's what he's mostly interested in and all. But anyway, he stood and prayed. And if you read between the lines here, you find that he wasn't actually standing to pray out of respect for God. He was more standing to pray so that people would see what he was doing, so that people could hear what he was praying. He was praying, standing to pray to be seen by men. So he stood and prayed. That's the first part about his prayer. Second thing we need to notice, his prayer was one of thanksgiving. Now, I've been told I am the eternal optimist, okay? I can find the good in just about any situation, find something positive. But did you notice that the Pharisee did not ask God for anything in his prayer? That's kind of hard to do if you think about it. I mean, try to pray for 2 minutes and not ask God for anything. It's hard to do. It really, truly is, because we have so much going on in our lives, though. But you know, the thanksgiving that this Pharisee extended was lost in the egotism, though. Notice also his actions. He highlights a couple of things that he does. First is fasting. On the Jewish calendar, there was only one specific fast that was required of Jews. That was on the Day of Atonement. 1 day a year, you were to fast. That's it. That was all that was required. However, if you were the quote-unquote super spiritual, the Jew, then you would fast twice a week. And more specifically than just twice a week, you would fast on Monday and on Thursday. You know why? Because Moses ascended Mount Sinai on a Monday, and he came down from Mount Sinai on a Thursday. That's what the tradition taught. And so this guy was one of the quote-unquote super spiritual. He fasted twice a week on those days when he showed how spiritual he was by denying himself food. And then tithing was another area where he talks about. He talks about how he gives 10% of all his income. Once again, he's going above and beyond what he has to do. Okay, because you're only required under the law to tithe certain parts of your income. Now, a lot of times, those parts of your income that you tithe actually came up to more than just 10% of your overall income, but that's another topic for another time. You were only required to tithe parts of your income, and yet he gave 10% of everything. So who he was a separated one. His job was obeying the law of Moses. What he prayed, he stood and prayed. His prayer was one of thanksgiving, but it was more egotistical than anything. His actions about fasting and prayer and everything. Look a little bit closer about how he acted. How he acted, quite honestly, was what we might call negative goodness. Notice the things that he congratulated himself on were things that he did not do, which was quite normal, actually, for a Pharisee. They were had separated themselves from other people, and they congratulated themselves on not doing what other people do. And that's how they worked. They obeyed what we might call the pyrite rule. You know what pyrite is, don't you? It's fool's gold. This is the fool's golden rule. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. So if you don't want to get punched in the face, don't punch anybody in the face. If you don't want to be kicked in the shins, don't kick anybody in the shins. You know, if you don't want somebody to do it to you, don't do it to anybody else. That's not really the golden rule. That's the pyrite rule. And you know, if you think about it, it's really not that hard to do, is it? I mean, if I challenged you to pray for 2 minutes without asking God for anything. If you adopted this style of prayer, you could probably do it. You could begin with, God, I thank you that I'm not a murderer. And God, I thank you that I don't commit adultery. And God, I thank you that I don't steal. And God, I thank you that, and on you could go with all these things that you don't do that other people do. You know, God, I thank you that I don't cheat on my taxes. God, I thank you that I don't, and you could go on and on and on. Negative goodness is not that difficult. It's much harder to do good than to just not do bad. And we need to understand that, and we need to not be satisfied with just not doing bad. We need to be active in doing good. So that's the Pharisee. There's also the tax man in this parable. Who he was, well, to understand who he was, we need to know a little bit about the Roman tax collection process. The way it worked was that Rome assessed a certain area, a certain sum in taxes. Then they went to the people in that area, and they allowed people to bid on how much taxes they could give to Rome. You know, the minimum was what Rome had assessed them, okay? So if Rome assessed, say, an area, we'll make it pretty simple, $75, and somebody bid, I can collect $100, and they were the high bidder, then they would be given the contract. They would become the chief tax collector. For example, Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. So, but the chief tax collector was not responsible for the 75 that Rome had assessed the area. The chief tax collector had to give Rome the 100 that he said he would. So what the chief tax collector might do is employ, say, 4 other people to be his tax collectors, and he would say, okay, I need each of you to collect $50 in taxes. Okay? Well, each of the 4 of them collect $50. 4 times 50 is 200. He sends 100 to Rome, and he's made $100 profit. But those 4 tax collectors, they would say, well, if I have to collect 50, I may as well try to get 100 or more. And so they would just go through the process of collecting just as much as they could. They would give the chief tax collector what he required. The chief tax collector would then give Rome what they required, and anything above that was what was profit for them. Really, a normal, ordinary person had absolutely no idea how much tax was, what the real tax was. And so they pretty much had to pay whatever the tax collector demanded them pay. The process was like this. There were 3 required taxes that every person had to pay. A poll tax, which really was a tax for the privilege of existing. Okay? There was a land tax, which was 1/10 of the produce of his ground, either in cash or in kind. And an income tax, which amounted to 1% of his annual income. That's not bad, is it? I'd take 1% of my annual income for taxes. Anyone here? That sound like a good thing to you? Well, anyway, the greatest opportunity for the tax collector was in what he would rather call custom duties. These were an import and an export tax. Anything that came into the country or left the country had to be taxed. There was a tax for entering a walled town, a tax for entering a harbor, a tax for crossing a bridge. There was a tax for using a main road, for possessing a cart. If you had a cart, then each wheel on that cart was taxed. And if you had an animal pulling the cart, they could tax the animal, and you would have to pay. And on it would go. The tax collector could stop a man anywhere and make him undo his bundles and demand a tax on just about any article that the man had with him. To make it worse, if the man couldn't afford to pay, the tax collector would offer a loan at a fairly high interest rate that would get him even further under his control. Now then, that having been said, and now that you know a little bit about the tax collection process in Rome, the Jews' view of tax collectors, I want you to think about how you feel about the IRS. Okay? Think about how you feel. I mean, this Tuesday, we have to pay the personal property tax and everything. By the way, it's Clergy Appreciation Month. I'm clergy, so if anyone wants to show their appreciation by paying my personal property tax, we're good with that, okay? I'm just kidding. Anyway, but actually today is Minister Appreciation. Anyway, and I'm not making this up, okay? Jonna will tell you she works for Dayspring, and it's a real thing, right? Yeah, shake your head. Yes, it's right. It's right. Okay, so anyway, anyway, Think about how you feel about the IRS. Well, Jews hated tax collectors. Not just because they were collecting taxes, but because they were seen as traitors. Despite all the other things mentioned, their crowning crime was that they were Jews who had sold themselves into the hands of the Roman government in order to make a profit off of the misfortunes of their fellow countrymen. Thus, the stock complaint against Jesus that he ate with tax collectors and sinners. They considered tax collectors their own category of sinner. There's tax collectors and then there's other sinners. And Jesus was fellowshipping with both. Now what he prayed, he stood but at a distance. Okay, from what I can see is he was standing for the right reason. And that's a stark contrast to the Pharisee who was standing so that he could be seen by others. This guy was standing far off. He was standing away from everybody, trying to, not to be seen perhaps. Maybe because of the fact that he was a tax collector. Maybe he didn't want people to see him, because they didn't like him and he didn't want them to do anything that he would regret later on. He stood but at a distance, and notice his prayer was one of asking. Remember, the Pharisee's prayer was one of thanksgiving. This guy's prayer is one of asking. All he does is ask God. But he only asks God for one thing, for mercy. That's it. He calls himself a sinner. God have mercy on me, a sinner. But actually, if you look in the Greek language, the Greek has a definite article before the word sinner. So it's, God have mercy on me, the sinner. He regarded himself as the sinner par excellence. He regarded himself as the absolute worst sinner in the world. Now, he doesn't elaborate on that. There's no mention of his deeds or anything like that, of what he's done so bad. Possibly the fact that he calls himself a sinner and that he was a tax collector, that probably summed up pretty much everything anyone needed to know about his deeds and how he was the sinner. Who he was? A Jew who was collecting taxes from his fellow Jews. What he prayed, he stood and prayed, asked for mercy. And finally, how he acted. He acted in true humility. True humility, you see, leads to knowledge. Leads to knowledge about a lot of things. See, if you know it all or you think you know it all, you're never going to learn. If you believe yourself to be the smartest person in the world, you're not going to ever learn anything. You're going to act that way and all. And in fact, that's not something that I said, but Plato, he was a pretty wise person. Plato wrote, "He is the wisest man who knows himself to be very ill qualified for the attainment of wisdom." In other words, the wisest person realizes just how much they don't know. To learn, we have to admit our own ignorance. The more we learn, the more aware we are of what we do not know. In fact, the second year of high school, the second year of college is called sophomore. That's your sophomore year. You know what the word sophomore means? Wise fool. It's Sophia, Greek for wisdom, and moros, which is Greek for the fool. We get our English word moron from it. So a wise fool. A sophomore should know enough to know that they don't know it all. So true humility leads to knowledge. But true humility also leads to God. Because, see, first it gives us a sense of our own inadequacy. See, the only thing that matters in this life is getting to heaven. And we understand that we couldn't do that on our own. We couldn't. It took Jesus dying on the cross to secure that for us. And second, it gives us a sense of our own sin. Have you ever noticed the people that we admire the most are most conscious of the sin in their lives? I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the life of Paul, okay? Paul the Apostle. We admire Paul. Wrote over half of the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, he says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." He's a good guy. He's a good guy to follow. But let's take a look at some of the things that he wrote. In Galatians 1, verse 1, he says, "Paul, an apostle, sent not from men nor by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead." Galatians is very likely the first letter that Paul wrote that we have preserved for us in the New Testament. And notice how he begins identifying himself as an apostle sent not by man, but by God. Okay? He starts off that way. Now, of course, in his other subsequent letters, he also identifies himself as an apostle. But let's look at some other ways that he identified himself as he moved forward and aged. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, he says, "For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." So he's gone in Galatians from saying an apostle sent not by man or from man, but by God, to I don't even deserve to be called an apostle. In Ephesians 3, verse 8, he says, "Although I am less than the least of all of God's people, this grace was given me to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ." Did you catch what he says there? Less than the least of all God's people. In other words, he's no more important than the least of the quote-unquote normal, ordinary church members. And in 1 Timothy 1, verse 15, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. "Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst." Paul says, I am the worst. I am worse than anyone in or out of the church. Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter. I'm the worst. See, the older Paul became, the nearer he got to Jesus Christ. And the nearer he got to Jesus Christ, the more he saw the difference between himself and Christ. And the more humble he became. True humility leads to God because it makes us aware of our own sin. What an incredible story about how we ought to pray. Notice the one that went home justified in the story before God, the tax collector. Sort of proves the point of passages like James 5, verse 10. "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up." And 1 Peter 5, 6. "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time." Notice, when we humble ourselves, it's not ourselves that lift us up. It's He who lifts us up. The last words of this parable bear repeating with regards to our prayers. "Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Are you humble when you pray? Most of us would probably say, well, yeah, I'm pretty humble when I pray. Yeah. But what about when you aren't exactly praying? How humble are you then? You might say, what does that have to do with anything? Excuse me. But at least I remembered. Anyway, where was I? Okay. What about when you aren't exactly praying? Are you humble then? See, 1 Thessalonians 5:17, Paul writes, "Pray continually. Pray without ceasing," depending on the version that you have. Now, this doesn't mean that we're supposed to walk around with our heads bowed and eyes closed and running into things and driving our car into things and stuff like that. That's not what he's talking about. It means that our lives ought to be lived as though they were a prayer of thanksgiving unto God. Is that how you're living your life? Living our lives as like we are thankful for the grace of God that He poured out into our lives is a continual prayer of thanks. So how is your prayer life? And yes, it is a lifestyle, prayer is. It's not about what you say, it's about how you live. So how are you living? How are you living your prayers? How is your prayer life that you are living? It needs help. We want to help. Oddly enough, the best way to do better in your prayer life is to just start praying. Maybe you won't need to do that this evening. Maybe you need to do it privately. Maybe you need to request prayers publicly. Whatever that situation is, if your life isn't what it needs to be, if your life isn't what God calls it to be, then make it right. Who can help you through a public response when you come to the front of that?